On a remote island off the coast of Scotland, a lighthouse suddenly went dark. No distress signal, no warning. When help finally arrived, 3 men had vanished without a trace. How do 3 trained men disappear from a locked island with nowhere to run? The date was December 15th, 1900. A passing steamship noticed something impossible. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse, a beacon that had guided ships through treacherous waters for barely a year, stood silent against the night sky. Its light, which should have been visible for miles, was extinguished. The captain of the vessel felt his stomach tighten. He knew what that lighthouse meant to ships navigating these waters. He knew the protocol. He knew that lighthouse keepers never let the light go dark. Never. But there it was, dark as the sea around it. He made a note in his log, hoping it was a temporary failure, perhaps a lamp needing repair. But as his ship passed into safer waters, a question gnawed at him. What could make experienced keepers allow their light to fail? Days passed. Other ships noticed the same thing. The lighthouse remained dark. Concern grew into alarm. The Northern Lighthouse Board, responsible for the station, grew increasingly worried. Bad weather had prevented any investigation, but as soon as conditions allowed, they would send help. But the most disturbing detail wasn't the empty lighthouse. It was the final message they left behind. The Flannan Isles are not a place for the weak-minded. 20 miles west of the Outer Hebrides, these jagged rocks rise from the Atlantic like the broken teeth of some ancient beast. The largest island, Islean Moor, barely spans 100 acres. No trees grow there. No permanent residents call it home. The waves that crash against its cliffs are relentless. In winter, they reach heights that seem impossible, as if the ocean itself is trying to reclaim the land. The wind howls without pause, carrying salt spray that stings exposed skin and corrodes metal within months. When the lighthouse was built in 1899, it represented both triumph and isolation. Its tower stretched 75 feet into the air, a monument to human determination. But to the men who worked there, it was something else entirely. A prison, a test of sanity. Lighthouse duty on Flannan Isles meant 6 weeks of isolation. 6 weeks of routine so strict it bordered on ritual. 6 weeks of nothing but the sound of wind, waves, and the mechanical turning of the light. 3 keepers worked in rotation, one always on watch, the others maintaining equipment, cooking, cleaning, recording weather observations. The work itself wasn't particularly difficult. The danger lay in the monotony, in the way hours blended into days, days into weeks. Men who worked here spoke of strange feelings, a sense of being watched, a pressure in the air before storms. Some called it superstition. Others weren't so sure. The island had a reputation among local fishermen. They avoided it when possible, spoke of it in hushed tones. Old stories lingered about Islean Moor, tales passed down through generations. Stories of men who disappeared, of light seen where no light should be, of voices carried on the wind. But these were just stories, weren't they? In December 1900, 3 men were sent to the Flannan Isles Lighthouse, never knowing it would be their last assignment. Thomas Marshall was 4 to 5 years old, a veteran keeper with more than 20 years of experience. He had requested this posting, believing he could handle the isolation. His superiors respected him. He was disciplined, methodical, the kind of man who followed every regulation to the letter. His wife and children waited for him on the mainland, counting the days until his rotation ended and he would return home for shore leave. Marshall kept a photograph of his family in his quarters. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, he would look at their faces and remind himself why the work mattered. The light he maintained saved lives. Ships relied on him. That gave the isolation meaning. James Duckett was 43, equally experienced, equally reliable. He was quieter than Marshall, a man who found peace in routine. Where Marshall enforced discipline through authority, Duckett led by example. He never raised his voice, never showed frustration. His colleagues found his calmness reassuring, especially during long assignments when tensions could rise over the smallest disagreements. Duckett had worked on Flannan Isles before. He knew the challenges. The way the wind could sound like screaming. The way waves struck the rocks with such force you felt it through the stone floor. He had learned to tune it out, to find a kind of meditation in the repetition of his duties. Donald MacArthur was younger, 40 years old, but no less experienced. He was known for his competence and, occasionally, his temper. Long periods of isolation affected him differently than the others. He grew restless, agitated, but he was professional. He knew how to control himself, how to channel his energy into work. The three men had worked together before. They understood each other's rhythms, knew when to give space and when to talk. They were as prepared as anyone could be for 6 weeks on that isolated rock. By Lighthouse rules, at least one man must always remain inside, always watching the light. The protocol existed for a reason. Safety, accountability, survival. Yet somehow, all three would disappear. December 15th, 1900 began like any other day for the crew of the steamship Archtor. They were making their way through familiar waters, using the Flannan Isles Lighthouse as a navigational reference. The captain had made this journey countless times. He knew when to expect that beam of light cutting through the darkness. But that night, there was nothing. He checked his charts, checked his position. No mistake. They were in the right place. The lighthouse should have been visible, should have been guiding them. Instead, there was only darkness. Another ship reported the same thing. And another. Something was wrong at Flannan Isles. The Northern Lighthouse Board received the reports with growing alarm. Joseph Moore, a relief keeper scheduled to replace one of the men, was supposed to make the journey on December 20th aboard the lighthouse tender Hesperus. But weather prevented the trip. Massive storms rolled across the Atlantic, making any approach to the island suicidal. Moore waited. The crew of the Hesperus waited. Everyone waited, hoping the lighthouse keepers were simply dealing with equipment failure, rationing oil, staying safe while the light remained dark. But deep down, Moore felt something was wrong. He had worked on Flannan Isles before. He knew Marshall, Duckett, and MacArthur. They would never let the light fail unless something catastrophic had happened. The storms continued for days. Waves reached 40 feet. Winds gusted strong enough to snap thick ropes. The island was unreachable. On December 26th, the weather finally broke enough to attempt landing. The Hesperus made its way toward Eileen Moore standing at the rail, staring at the lighthouse. It stood silent against the winter sky. No smoke rose from the chimney. No flag flew to acknowledge their approach. No sign of life at all. By the time anyone reached the island, whatever happened was already over. Joseph Moore was the first to step onto the dock. The usual protocol was simple. Fire a flag. Ring the bell. Wait for the keepers to acknowledge the supply ship's arrival. Someone would come down to help unload supplies, to receive mail, to share news from the mainland. Moore fired the flag. No response. He rang the bell, the sound echoing off the cliffs. Nothing. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crash of waves and the cry of seabirds. He felt his chest tighten. Something was profoundly wrong. The captain of the Hesperus sent 2 crew members to accompany Moore. They climbed the steep path to the lighthouse, their boots crunching on gravel. Moore called out names. Marshall, Duckett, MacArthur. His voice was swallowed by the wind. The entrance gate stood open. That alone was unusual. Keepers were supposed to keep gates locked when not in use. Moore pushed forward, his unease growing with each step. The main door was unlocked. Moore opened it slowly, calling out again. The interior of the lighthouse was dim, cold. He could see his breath in the air. Everything looked normal at first glance. The main room was tidy. Equipment sat in its proper place. The clock on the wall had stopped. Moore noted the time, sometime in the early morning, though the exact moment was impossible to determine. They moved through the lighthouse systematically. The kitchen showed signs of a meal interrupted. Plates sat on the table. Food had been prepared but not eaten. The fire in the stove was cold, dead for days. In the sleeping quarters, 2 of the 3 beds were unmade. The third was made, blankets tucked with military precision. Personal effects remained undisturbed. Marshall's family photograph sat on a small shelf. Duckett's pipe rested in its usual spot. MacArthur's journal lay closed on his bunk. Moore picked up the journal, his hands trembling slightly. These men didn't just vanish. They left everything behind. The crew searched every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. They called out until their voices grew hoarse. The lighthouse was empty. It looked like the men had simply stepped out. Moore returned to the main room, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Free experienced keepers don't just abandon their post. The regulations were clear. The protocol was absolute. Someone always stays inside. One of the crew members called from the entrance. His voice carried an edge of alarm that made Moore's skin prickle. Outside, investigators found something that changed everything. The western landing platform told a story of violence. Iron railings, thick as a man's wrist, were bent and twisted. A wooden supply box, secured to the platform with heavy ropes, had been crushed like paper. A massive rock, weighing over a ton, had been displaced from its position and lay several feet away. The grass leading down to the platform was flattened in a pattern that suggested something enormous had swept across it. Debris was scattered everywhere, pieces of wood and metal mixed with seaweed torn from the rocks below. Moore stood at the edge of the platform, staring down at the sea. Even now, in relatively calm conditions, the waves struck with tremendous force. During a storm, the power would be unimaginable. But there was more. In the storage area near the platform, 2 sets of oilskins were missing. Oilskins were essential gear, heavy waterproof coats that keepers wore when working outside in bad weather. The absence of 2 sets suggested 2 men had gone out. But 1 set remained, hung neatly on its hook. That detail gnawed at Moore. If 2 men went outside during a storm, why wasn't the third wearing his oilskins? And more importantly, why would he have followed them outside at all? Lighthouse protocol was absolute on this point. If 2 keepers needed to go outside for any reason, the third remained inside. Always. No exceptions. The safety of the station depended on it. Yet all 3 men were gone. Moore tried to reconstruct what might have happened. Perhaps MacArthur and Duckett went outside to secure equipment. Perhaps they saw something, a damaged railing or a loose box. Perhaps they called for help. But why would Marshall, the most experienced and disciplined keeper, abandon his post? Why would he rush outside without his oilskins? The crew of the Hesperus spread out, searching the island. They found nothing. No bodies. No footprints leading away from the lighthouse. No sign that the men had tried to reach another part of the island. Eilean Moor was small enough to search thoroughly in a matter of hours. There were no caves, no hidden valleys, no places where 3 men could be hiding or trapped. They were simply gone. Moore walked back to the lighthouse, his mind racing. He needed to check the log. Keepers were required to record everything: weather observations, maintenance tasks, visitor arrivals, anything unusual. The log might provide answers. He found it in the main room, sitting on the desk where it always sat today. The last entries were dated December 15th, the date the light went dark. Moore began to read, and with each word, his confusion deepened into something closer to dread. Then investigators read the final logbook entry. The logbook entries for December 12th were routine. Weather observations recorded at regular intervals. Wind speed, cloud cover, sea conditions. Everything normal. Everything professional. December 13th showed a change. The handwriting remained steady, but the content shifted. Storm raging. Wind unlike anything experienced before. James Duckett very quiet. Thomas Marshall showing signs of distress. Moore frowned. December 13th had been calm across the entire region. Ship's logs confirmed it. Weather stations on surrounding islands reported normal conditions. Yet this entry described a severe storm. The next entry, later that day, was worse. Storm still raging. Donald MacArthur crying, praying for the storm to end. Moore felt ice in his stomach. MacArthur was known for his temper, not his emotions. The idea of him crying seemed impossible. And Marshall showing distress. The man was unshakable. December 14th. Storm continues. All three of us staying inside. Unable to go outside. Fear taking hold. But December 14th had also been calm. Multiple witnesses confirmed it. The final entry was dated December 15th, written in the early afternoon. Storm ended. Sea calm. God is over all. Then nothing. Moore read the entries again, trying to make sense of them. 3 experienced keepers describing conditions that didn't exist, reporting fear and distress over weather that never happened. Had they lost their minds? All 3 of them. He thought about the isolation. 6 weeks on a rock in the Atlantic could break a man. But all 3 simultaneously. And why would their madness take the identical form, all seeing the same phantom storm? Unless it wasn't madness. Moore looked around the empty lighthouse. The silence pressed in on him. He thought about the local stories, the fishermen's warnings about Eilean Moor. He thought about the way the island felt, even now in daylight with a queue of men around him. What had these men experienced? The Hesperus captain insisted their return to the mainland immediately. He wanted to report what they'd found. The authorities needed to know. An investigation would be launched. Moore took one last look around before leaving. He walked through each room, trying to feel something, some presence of the men who had lived here. But there was nothing, just emptiness. As they sailed away from Eilean Moor, Moore watched the lighthouse recede into the distance. He couldn't shake the feeling that something essential had been left unexplained. That whatever happened on that island was beyond the simple explanations investigators would offer. The case was officially closed within weeks. The conclusion was straightforward. The men had gone outside during a storm, likely to secure equipment. A massive wave had swept them into the sea. Their bodies were never recovered because the Atlantic doesn't give back what it takes. But the questions never stopped. The official report satisfied bureaucratic requirements but convinced almost no one who examined the evidence closely. The rogue wave theory made practical sense. The Atlantic is capable of producing waves of extraordinary size, particularly in winter. These waves can appear without warning, even in otherwise calm seas. If such a wave struck while the men were on the western platform, they would have had no chance of survival. The physical evidence supported this. The bent railings, the crushed supply box, the displaced rock. These weren't signs of an ordinary storm but of a single catastrophic event. But the theory had problems. Why were all 3 men outside? The protocol was absolute. One keeper always remained inside. Always. Marshall knew this. Duckett knew this. MacArthur knew this. Some suggested that 2 men went out, were caught by the wave, and the third rushed out without thinking, overcome by panic or a desperate attempt to help. But that didn't explain the missing oilskins. If Marshall had rushed out in a panic, why would he stop to grab his oilskins but then not put them on? Unless he never grabbed them. Unless someone else did. But that made even less sense. Others proposed a different scenario. Perhaps one man fell while working outside. Perhaps the second went to help. Perhaps Marshall heard their cries and abandoned protocol in a moment of crisis, rushing out to save his colleagues. It was plausible. Fear and adrenaline can override training. Marshall was human. After all, the sound of his colleagues in danger might have broken through his discipline. But that still didn't explain the logbook entries. The phantom storm haunted everyone who read those words. 3 men, trained observers who recorded weather data daily, all describing conditions that didn't exist, all expressing fear and distress over something that wasn't there. Theories emerged. Perhaps the isolation had affected them. Perhaps the stress of the work, combined with the approaching Christmas season and longing for family, had created a shared delusion. Group psychosis, some called it. when individuals in close proximity begin to share the same hallucinations, the same fears. It's rare but documented. Yet these were experienced keepers. Marshall had more than 20 years of service. If isolation caused psychosis, wouldn't he have shown signs before? Wouldn't any of them? Other theories strayed into darker territory. Perhaps something else was on the island. Something they saw or experienced that couldn't be recorded in an official log. Something that terrified them enough to describe it only as a storm, the closest natural phenomenon to whatever they faced. These theories were dismissed as superstition. The modern world had no room for such explanations. The Northern Lighthouse Board needed a rational conclusion. A wave. An accident. Tragedy. But explicable tragedy. The families of the three men were told their loved ones died serving their duty. The bodies were never recovered, but that wasn't unusual in such circumstances. The Atlantic keeps its dead. Marshall's wife received his possessions. The photograph he kept of his family. His logbooks from previous assignments. She held them and wept, unable to accept that she would never know what happened to her husband in those final moments. Duckett's family received similar items. His pipe, his journals, objects that had been part of his daily life but now seemed like artifact from another world. MacArthur's belongings were sent to his next of kin. Among them was his personal journal, the one Moore had seen on his bunk. The family read it, hoping for answers. The final entry was dated December 14th. I can hear it outside. We all can. God help us. The family shared this detail with investigators. It was noted and filed away. It didn't change the official conclusion, but it changed everything for those who knew. Why were all three men outside? Why did they describe a storm that never existed? Why did the logbook contradict reality? And even today, no bodies have ever been found. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse still stands. It was automated in 1971, the last human keepers departing without ceremony. Machines took over the work, sensors and timers replacing the human presence that had maintained the light for 70 years. No one works there now. No one lives there. The lighthouse functions without human intervention, its beams still cutting through the darkness, still warning ships away from the rocks. But the island has never felt empty. Maintenance crews who visit Flannan Isles report feelings of unease, a sense of being watched, a heaviness in the air that has nothing to do with weather. They complete their work quickly and leave. No one lingers. Local fishermen still avoid the island when possible. The old stories persist, merged now with a newer tragedy. The story of three men who vanished without explanation has become part of the island's folklore. Another layer of mystery added to centuries of whispered tales. Tourists occasionally visit, drawn by the mystery. They walk the same paths the keepers walked. They stand at the western platform where the evidence of violence remains visible in the twisted metal and displaced stones. They take photographs and speculate. But at night, when the tool boats have left and the island returns to silence, Flannan Isles belongs to something else. To memory. To questions. To the ghosts of three men who walked into mystery and never returned. Investigators over the decades have revisited the case, applying new technology and new theories. Each investigation reaches the same conclusion. The evidence suggests a tragic accident. A wave. A moment of poor judgment. Human error compounded by natural force. Yet the logbook entries remain unexplained. The phantom storm remains unexplained. The violation of protocol remains unexplained. Some mysteries resist solution not because evidence is lacking but because the evidence points in directions we are unwilling to follow. Because the answers require us to consider possibilities that don't fit our understanding of how the world works. What did Thomas Marshall, James Duckett, and Donald MacArthur experience in those final days? What storm raged in their perception while the sea remained calm? What drove three disciplined, experienced men to abandon every rule they had lived by? We don't know. We will probably never know. The lighthouse still stands, a monument to human determination and human fragility. Its light still guides ships through dangerous waters. But it also stands as a reminder that some places hold secrets too deep for understanding. Sometimes, the scariest mysteries aren't about what we see, but about what vanishes without explanation. About the gaps in our knowledge that no amount of investigation can fill. About the moments when trained professionals, rational men, encounter something that breaks them. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse Keeper mystery remains unsolved not for lack of theories, but because every theory fails to account for something. The wave doesn't explain the logbook. The psychosis doesn't explain the physical evidence. The accident doesn't explain why all three men were outside. Perhaps that's the real lesson. Not every mystery has a solution we can accept. Not every disappearance has a satisfying explanation. Sometimes people vanish, and all we're left with are questions and silence. 3 men walked into the unknown on a remote island in December 1900. They left behind families who never stopped wondering. They left behind colleagues who never stopped questioning. They left behind a mystery that has endured for more than a century. What happened on that island? The lighthouse knows. The sea knows. But they are not telling. And maybe that's how it should be. Maybe some stories end without resolution, without closure, without the comfort of understanding. Maybe that's what makes them endure. The light still burns on Flannan Isles. It burns for the ships that need guidance. But perhaps it also burns for 3 men who vanished into mystery. A memorial flame that will never be extinguished. Would you have gone outside that day? If you heard your colleagues calling, if you felt the island trembling beneath your feet, if you knew the rules but also knew that men needed help, what would you have done? Would you have stayed inside, following protocol, trusting that they would return? Or would you have stepped out into the unknown, knowing you might never come back? We like to think we know what we would do in crisis. We imagine ourselves calm, rational, following procedure. But when the moment comes, when fear and adrenaline take over, when we're faced with the impossible, we don't know ourselves at all. Thomas Marshall didn't know. James Duckett didn't know. Donald MacArthur didn't know. They made their choices on a winter day in 1900, and those choices led them somewhere we cannot follow. The lighthouse stands. The mystery endures. The questions remain. And somewhere in the darkness, on a remote island where the wind never stops and the waves never rest, 3 men are still missing. Still waiting to be found. Still waiting to be understood. The light goes round. The beam cuts through the night. Ships pass safely because of that light. But on Eilean Moor, in the spaces between the light's revolutions, in the moments of darkness before the beam returns, something remains. Something that took 3 men and never gave them back. Something that we will never fully understand. This is the mystery of Flannan Isles. This is the story of 3 lighthouse keepers who vanished after the light went out. This is what happened. And this is what we will never know. What do you think happened on that island? Would you have gone outside or stayed inside? Like, comment, subscribe for more true mysteries.